2, returning to our study in the life of King David. I was thinking of how fitting it is that our communion meal involves Chinese food. Doesn't have to be, always fitting. Yeah, that's always fitting. It doesn't have to be Chinese food, but Jesus did not come to be the Savior of American believers only. I remember having to tell my Chinese students when I spent a year in China, nearly 20 years ago, they thought Christianity was sort of an American thing. And I had to tell them that Jesus looked a lot more like them than he did like me. But there's Joseph and Mary, right? This new little baby in this obscure stable in Bethlehem. And then the Magi come from the east, perhaps from China. And all of a sudden, the light bulbs go on. This is about a lot more than Israel. Jesus had come to be the Savior of the world. And so there's something kind of beautiful in seeing some of those various ethnic flavors woven into God's great story as we celebrate his redemption of some from every tongue and tribe and nation. So great opportunity. 2 Samuel chapter 2, again, returning to our study here in the life of David. I want to read these first 4 verses in chapter 2 to set the stage for us this morning. 2 Samuel 2, verse 1. After this, David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah?" And the Lord said to him, "Go up." David said, "To which shall I go up?" And he said, "To Hebron." So David went up there, and his 2 wives also, Ahinoam of Jezreel, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David brought up his men who were with him, everyone with his household, and they lived in the towns of Hebron. And the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. So David is king. Been waiting for this for a while, haven't we? And it helps us to think about the fact that there are a couple of distinct segments of David's life. There is a pretty good-sized segment of his life in which he had been anointed as king, but was not openly recognized as such. There were a few ragtag followers who gave allegiance to David, recognized that he was God's choice for the next king, but they were very few. He spent his time on the run. He was under the curse in the sense that even for a time he had to go and live in one of the Philistine cities. If you read the text, it's clear he wasn't just rejected by Saul, but in some sense he was rejected by the entire nation. He had to go to the Philistine city. So that's the part 1. And that was 14 years of David's life. That was a long time to wait. And then, of course, we come here to 2 Samuel chapter 2, and we find that he is now anointed, recognized, installed, inaugurated, publicly, visibly, formally, as king. There was still going to be some remaining chapters here. We're going to find that for the first 7 years of David's reign, it was a limited reign. He wasn't ruling over the entire nation. And then eventually he comes to Jerusalem, and he reigns for another 33 years, a full golden era, a reign of peace over the entire nation. But I just want you to think about the fact that there was an unfolding to David's kingdom. And fitting lens by which to view the ministry of another king, and that being King Jesus, who was anointed as king by his Father. That's what the word Christ or Messiah means. It means anointed one. Jesus was the anointed one, the one who God set apart as being the capital K king, the high king, the King of Kings. But he was not recognized as such. Suffered under the curse, even to the point of hanging on a cruel Roman cross. There was a few who recognized his kingship and lived under his reign. But of course, like David, there will be a time when Jesus is inaugurated and assumes the throne and rules openly. There's an unfolding aspect to the reign of Christ. Of course, we live in this in-between time, don't we? We live in the time in which he's been anointed as king, but not openly recognized as such. So there's a few, hopefully we can be those loyal, we are those loyal subjects who recognize, well, the king has not come and fully established his reign, that he is king. He's gone on a journey, but he will return. And when he does, he will rule in power and glory. But David is king. It's a transition point for us, an important point in the life of David. 14 years after being told that he was going to be king, it has now come to fruition. 14 years of waiting, and the moment has finally arrived. I tell my kids that the next time they want to do something. Well, David waited 14 years. It's a long time to wait, isn't it? 14 years of being on the run, and now he's living in relative security. 14 years of being pursued, misrepresented, mistreated, and now the tables have been turned. 14 years of submitting to Saul's authority, biting his tongue, and now he is in position of power. It's interesting to think about, isn't it? What would you do if you were king? What would you do if you had the chance to implement your first executive actions? What would be the marks of your kingdom? And we have to think about it specifically by asking, what would you do if the tables were turned? How would you respond if, after being persecuted and misrepresented and betrayed for 14 years, all of a sudden you are given the authority? What would you do? What would be the marks of your kingdom? Well, I read those opening verses of chapter 2, but in these first few chapters here in 2 Samuel, there's three little episodes I want to just draw attention to that I think answer that question, at least for David. What were the marks of the kingdom that he was going to establish? Three separate instances, episodes, and yet I would say three episodes that have a common thread. The consistent tone that David was establishing for his kingdom. So we're going to look at that briefly, do a little survey here of these chapters, and then I want to focus in on that one theme or that thread. What's the recurring message or the value of the kingdom? And we'll work some application and reflect on some application from there. So 3 episodes. First one, here in chapter 1, David refused to celebrate the demise of his enemies. David refused to celebrate the demise of his enemies. A very interesting opening scene. Saul was up in the northern part of Israel fighting against the Philistines. And you'll remember that David had been living with the Philistines, but as the Philistines prepared for battle against Israel, some of the Philistine commanders didn't trust David, and so they sent him away. So the Philistines, Saul up in the north, David, meanwhile, and his men return to the south, where they find that their wives and their children and all their possessions have been taken captive by the Amalekites. And so they go after the Amalekites, and God graciously had preserved all of their family, and they won a great victory. So Saul's way up here, David's way down in the south. And a messenger comes to David. And the messenger says, Saul and Jonathan are dead. The guy's tattered, dirt in his hair, smells really bad. Journeyed for a couple days to get to David, to give him this message. Saul and Jonathan are dead. And David says to him, how do you know? Are you sure? And this messenger says, absolutely, I saw it with my own eyes. I'm there in the battlefield, and I'm coming by, and who's there but Saul? He's leaning on his spear. He's in the throes of death. And he motions me over and asks me to put him out of his misery before the Philistines capture him and torture him. And so I did. So I know for sure he's dead. No doubt this messenger thought that this would be real pleasing to David. Perhaps there's a possibility he's making the whole thing up. Read the account of David's death in 1 Samuel. This guy's not mentioned at all. Possibility he actually he comes with Saul's crown and armlets, the symbols of his royal authority, and he comes to bring these to David. You're the king now. Maybe there was even a crack of a smile on his face. Finally, Saul's out of the way. Well, notice how David responds. 2 Samuel 1, verse 11. And David took hold of his clothes and tore them. And so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son and for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. And David said to the young man who told him, where do you come from? And he answered, I am the son of a sojourner, an Amalekite. David said to him, how is it you were not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? By the way, the Amalekites probably were not real high on David's list right now. Okay. He says, what gave you the sense of authority to go and strike down God's king? Verse 15, then David called one of the young men and said, go execute him. And he struck him down so that he died. And David said to him, your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed. You admitted it yourself that you took Saul's life. David had multiple opportunities to kill Saul himself. He didn't do it as a matter of principle, because God had placed Saul in a position of authority. Who was he to take Saul's life? This type of vigilante justice, taking matters into your own hands, would not be tolerated. And so David sends a message by having this messenger executed for his crime. And then he leads the nation in mourning for Saul and Jonathan. Very interesting tone, isn't it? The outset of David's reign and the context of his newly inaugurated kingdom. There's a second scene, and that's in chapter 2, verses 5 through 7, or 4, the end of verse 4 through 7. Chapter 2, verses 4 through 7. And here we see that David honored those who honored his enemies. So he refused to celebrate his enemy's demise. Here we see that he honors those, he goes out of his way to honor those who acted kindly toward his enemies. Verse 4. When they told David it was the men of Jabesh-Gilead who buried Saul, David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh-Gilead and said to them, may you be blessed by the Lord, because you showed this loyalty to Saul your Lord and buried him. Now may the Lord show steadfast love and faithfulness to you, and I will do good to you, because you have done this thing. Now therefore let your hands be strong and be valiant, for Saul your Lord is dead, and the house of Judah has anointed me king over them. So this account is actually told in fullness back at the end of 1 Samuel. Saul and Jonathan are struck down in the field of battle. The Philistines come. They take Saul's body. They put it up on a post. up against the wall in one of their headquarters as a symbol of their victory, their superiority over Saul and the nation of Israel. The men of Jabesh Gilead, valiant men, text says, have to be valiant. They go into enemy territory. They travel through the night. Great personal sacrifice and risk to reclaim Saul's body. You take it back into Israelite territory and give Saul a proper burial. It's interesting to think about why they did this. They were not of Saul's tribe. Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin. These men of Jabesh Gilead were not. Matter of fact, again, we're way up in the north of Israel. Saul's territory was down in the south, his hometown. But these men of Jabesh Gilead were up in the north country there, and they did this. Interesting to think about the timing. Saul's popularity, his approval ratings had been slipping consistently. Okay, this was not a good time to necessarily, jump on Saul's bandwagon. And when you understand the context, the most customary thing a new king would do would be to kill off the old king's family. And anybody else associated with the old king who might be a threat to your throne, who might be disloyal to you. So these men might have risked more than their lives as they went against the Philistines and went into Philistine territory. But they might have also had some concerns about how David would feel about this. Here they're showing this tremendous loyalty to Saul. David's the new king. How would David feel about this? Well, the text is pretty clear, isn't it? David commends them. It's interesting. Why would these men do this? There's an answer to that question. 40 years previous, when Saul was just beginning his kingdom, he rescued the men of Jabesh Gilead, the city of Jabesh Gilead. There were some really bad things that were going to happen to the people of Jabesh Gilead. The Ammonites had surrounded their city. They were under siege. It was going to get ugly. And Saul came to their rescue. 40 years go by, and they remembered. And so David says to them, you did exactly the right thing. You honored the person that God had placed as king over you. You demonstrated tremendous loyalty and fidelity. You are the type of people that I want in my kingdom. He commends them. Interesting. Sets a tone here in this little episode here. There's a third episode as well. This one picks up in chapter 2, verse 8, and really goes through the end of chapter 3. And here we see that David refuses to harbor a grudge against his enemies. He refuses to harbor a grudge against his enemies. I told you that when David first came to power, there was opposition. Okay? And there's a lot of names here in this section. So I've given you a little chart, help you think about how this all pieces together. This is what sort of flows out in these next couple of chapters here. First you have these two kings. That's the top line, the blue line. You have David, and then you have Ishbosheth, who was a rival king. He happened to be one of the sons of Saul. So he had a natural claim to the throne, right? And then you have the domain. David was ruling over Judah. There was one tribe out of the 12 tribes of Israel. There was one tribe that aligned themselves with David. It was David's home tribe, okay, his hometown. Ishbosheth, on the other hand, had the other 11 tribes on his side. And then you have some key figures as well, or what I've called army commanders. David had 3 really brave warriors that are highlighted in this text. They happen to be brothers. Joab and Asahel and Abishai. And they were fierce warriors, valued by David. Joab distinguished himself among the 3 and was named David's army commander. Now, Ishbosheth also had an army commander. His name was Abner. And that name should ring some bells because Abner was Saul's army commander while Saul was still living. So Abner, he was the grizzled general. He had won many battles for Israel under King Saul and was loyal to Saul's house. And so he aligned himself with Ishbosheth and served as his army commander. Okay, so when we think about this here, and for 7 years, there was a lot of fighting going on between these two groups. There was some pretty significant bad blood, okay, between these two groups. Matter of fact, one of these encounters, one of these battles, Abner, Ishbosheth's army commander, killed Asahel, Joab's brother. So Joab hated Abner. He was looking for every opportunity to get revenge against Abner. And it wasn't just Joab. David was not a real big Abner fan either. You'll remember some of the previous episodes. David made some pretty overt accusations against Abner. He accused Abner of poisoning Saul against him. Those 14 years in the wilderness, at least part of that was Abner's fault. Because Abner's feeding Saul information. You can't trust David. You can't. And then you remember that the one encounter, David comes into Saul's camp. Remember this? All of Saul's soldiers are all sleeping around him, and Saul's in the very center with Abner right next to him, his army commander. And David sneaks in, and he takes Saul's spear and his water bottle, and he tiptoes back out of the camp. And then he gets a safe distance away, and he calls back, and he says, Abner, what are you doing? You're supposed to be guarding the king. He said this to Abner. He said, you ought to be executed. That is a capital offense. So there's no love lost between Joab and Abner, between David and Abner. I mean, there's some serious feuding, bad blood that was going on between these two groups. Okay, and that's a very important part of the story here. Well, over the course of these 7 years, David gets stronger, and Ishbosheth gets weaker. And finally, Abner, Ishbosheth's general, comes to David, asks for an audience, comes into Hebron, perhaps waving a white flag, and he says to David, you win. I will make arrangements so that the other 11 tribes will come under your authority. Okay. Surprisingly, after all the water that's gone under the bridge, David receives Abner graciously and sends him on his way in peace. No sooner had Abner left the city of Hebron after his meeting with David than Joab shows up. He had been out fighting some battles. And when he hears that Abner had been there to see David and that David let him go in peace, he was furious. What are you doing, David? He is our sworn enemy. He is powerful, influential. He happens to be Saul's cousin. For all of these reasons and a million more, you should have taken care of him. You should have killed him. And Joab had his own set of unresolved anger and bitterness because of the death of his brother. So Joab determines Abner is not going to get away with it. He sends a message to Abner. Presumably that message said something like, please return to Hebron. David has some more things to talk to you about that he forgot to mention. And so the messenger goes and gets Abner, and Abner comes back to the city of Hebron, and who's there at the city gate but Joab? And Joab says, yeah, come here. I want to relay a message to you from David. He pulls him aside, puts his arm around him, reaches in and grabs his knife and stabs him in cold blood in peacetime. And David was not happy. Okay? How would David respond? Well, notice his response. Chapter 3, verse 28. He hears what Joab has done. He says, "May it fall upon the head of Joab and upon all his father's house, and may the house of Joab never be without one who has a discharge, or who is leprous, or who holds a spindle, or who falls by the sword, or who lacks bread." So Joab and Abishai, his brother, killed Abner. They plotted because Abner had put their brother Asahel to death in the battle at Gibeon. Then David said to Joab and to all the people who were with him, "Tear your clothes and put on sackcloth and mourn before Abner." And King David followed the bier. They buried Abner at Hebron, and the king lifted up his voice and wept at the grave of Abner, and all the people wept. And the king lamented for Abner, saying, "Should Abner die as a fool dies? Your hands were not bound, your feet were not fettered. As one falls before the wicked, you have fallen." And all the people wept again over him. Then all the people came to persuade David to eat bread while it was yet day. But David swore, saying, "God do so to me, and more also, if I taste bread or anything else till the sun goes down." And all the people took notice of it, and it pleased them, as everything that the king did pleased all the people. So all the people and all Israel understood that day that it had not been the king's will put to death Abner, the son of Ner. So I think David was upset, not just because of what Joab had done, an act of sinful violence, but David was upset because it reflected poorly on him. The assumption would be that David had orchestrated these events to bring about Abner's demise. There's no secret that David wasn't a big Abner fan. But there was history there between the two of them. David wanted to go to great lengths to demonstrate that is simply not the case. He calls down a curse on Joab. He forces Joab and his men to tear their clothes and lead the funeral procession. He gives Abner a state funeral, all the honors, and a burial site there in Hebron, of great honor. He offered a personal and heartfelt word of lament in honor of Abner. And he engaged in a period of fasting, even when his men urged him to eat. And the people noticed. Remember we said David's sending a message? He's establishing a tone at the outset. Here we're told overtly at the close of this episode that the people were taking notice. They were watching David and what he was doing and the message he was sending. Again, it would have been customary to destroy all the living relatives of the previous king, anyone who was a threat to the throne, but David goes out of his way to prevent this type of bloodshed. Saul's reign was marked by petty insecurities, violent retribution, and just a lot of real ugly behavior. But this was a new day and a new kingdom, and David was setting a new tone. Now, I want you to note here the last two verses of chapter 3, because we get a really unique insight here. I think this is the lens, the interpretive lens for this particular section. Up until this point, David's been talking to the people. He's been talking to Joab. He's been lamenting at this public funeral. But here, we see that David steps into his inner court. He goes back into his room or his palace there in Hebron, and he confides in his servants, in his stewards, in his inner council. Could be that what David was saying out there could have been perceived as sort of damage control, right? He's trying to stop the cycle of violence. He's trying to pacify people. But here in the inner court, we see what's going on in his heart. We see the interior values that are shaping his kingdom policy. Verse 38, he makes a statement about Abner. He honors Abner for his great contributions. In spite of their personal history, Abner had won a lot of battles, and David honors that. And then in verse 39, David lays out a contrast. Notice verse 39, "And I was gentle today, though anointed king, These men, the sons of Zeruiah, are more severe than I. The Lord repay the evildoer according to his wickedness. So David establishes a contrast between himself and the sons of Uriah. That would be Joab and Abishai. Those are the sons of Uriah, right? So he's making a contrast. He says, I acted with gentleness, with restraint. The sons of Zeruiah, Joab, and Abishai acted with harshness, with manipulation, with deceit. They were underhanded, dirty pool. Particularly, this had to do with how they each treated Abner. There's two different ways of interpreting this text, and even the way it's translated or rendered is a little bit different. Okay, and both of these would be plausible. So I've tried to just paint out these options for you. What's really going on here? This is the crux of it. Okay, so it's important that we get this. What is going on here? What is David really saying? Now, one option would be that David is voicing his inability to do anything about Joab. It's like, my hands are tied. Even though I'm king, I'm not able to do anything against these rogues. They're too powerful for me. The NIV, the way it's translated and rendered, could lead you to think that that's what's going on. David's just putting up his hands. But I think there's another option, and I think a more viable option. And that is that David is making a statement about the distinctive nature of his reign. I think it could go something like this. Even though I am king and I have the authority, I acted gently toward Abner, whereas Joab and Abishai have been harsh and violent in their response. They talk about the fact that he's king. It's not that David is this kind of cowering over in the corner over here, and Joab is, wielding all the power in the kingdom. No, David says, look, I'm the king. I could have treated Abner in any way that I chose to treat him. But I chose to demonstrate restraint. I chose to act with gentleness. We might say I chose to act with grace. I think that's really what's going on there. Abner comes. David doesn't like Abner. David has a history with Abner. He could be bitter towards Abner, but he chooses to demonstrate restraint, even though he has the power to do otherwise. Joab, on the other hand, harbors the grudge, feeds the bitterness, and when he has the opportunity, acts in violence toward Abner. That's what David is contrasting here in verse 39. That's the interior work that's informing his kingdom ethics. And by the way, the ethics of David's kingdom point us to the ethics of Jesus' kingdom. Or there's another king who would come, who would be a gentle king. He would be a king who would be born to a peasant couple from Nazareth. He would be born in a stable and placed in a lowly manger. There's another king that would, when he came before his people and was acknowledged as king, would come not riding on a white steed, but riding on a donkey. Gentle king. As we read the writings of the Apostle Paul and Peter, it's clear that this is the ethic of the kingdom. We too are to be clothed with gentleness and meekness. I'm grateful that we have a gentle king. Aren't you? A king who is gracious and willing to demonstrate restraint and patience when he has the power to bring judgment. I wonder if your life reflects the values of his kingdom. Is your life marked by gentleness and restraint, or are you known for being a bit of a hothead? Someone who's harsh and cutting with their words. By the way, there's more ways to enact violence than just simply a knife in the stomach, right? Lots of ways we have of getting even, making a point, of hurting someone else. The vast majority of people would say Joab was spot on. He had the moral high ground to do what he did. But David inaugurates a different kingdom, a kingdom that's marked by gentleness and grace. But God's been teaching me in this area. Had a really frustrating experience this week. Computer, my daughter's computer, laptop, coming apart. The casing was kind of cracked. I had put some screws back in the holes to try to, sort of hold it together. And I was so glad that I had bought the warranty program. I never buy the warranty. Never. Not the 2-year, no. They don't even get the words out of their mouth. And I'm like, no. But my daughter's going to be off at school, a good dad. I ought to, make the extra step, to make sure that her computer is covered. So we send this thing back in, and they say the warranty has been voided because I made repairs to the computer. I put the screws back in to keep it together until they could fix it. It's not like I cracked the thing open and tried to work on the circuitry. But I voided the warranty. Boy, I was hot. I wish I responded with gentleness. But I think that's the real ticket. That's the challenge, isn't it? When you have the moral high ground, when you have the right to drop the hammer, right? And you don't do it. That's gentleness. That's David. That's Jesus. The high king. This is the ethic of the kingdom that we've been given. We've got some work to do to evidence that type of characteristic. Father, we are so thankful today that we serve a gentle king. A king who has been patient with us. A king who, even there on the cross, as the soldiers are calling taunts, come down off the cross, and knowing that Jesus could have done that. He could have struck them dead without ever coming down off the cross. And yet he demonstrated meekness and gentleness, demonstrated amazing restraint and grace. And I pray, God, that you would foster and cultivate that quality in us too. We confess it is not our natural inclination. We are inclined with Joab and the vast majority of society in claiming the moral high ground and pursuing justice at all costs, settling the score. But we've received a new calling. We've been made citizens of a new kingdom. And it is imperative, God, that we live out the ethics of that kingdom by your grace. So we ask that you help us. And if there's one here today, God, who's never come to know that gentle king, who's living in animosity against him, that God, today would be a day they bow the knee. And they come to serve this king and experience the peace that he alone can bring. God, we thank you again for this text. Ask that you do this work in us. In Christ's name, amen. Amen. You're dismissed. We'll be gathering down in the Family Center here in just a few moments to enjoy the Lord's table together.